You're listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
Good evening. The UN's top human rights official didn't mince her words this morning. Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner, told her council that what Israel was doing in Gaza could amount to war crimes. Israel regards the UN Human Rights Council as biased against it, and to the extent that the Council has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than the whole of the rest of the world put together, may have a point. But as a global television audience watches the mounting death toll of the latest Israeli crackdown on Gaza, the arguments over who's to blame become ever more rancorous. Israel says it has a right to defend itself. Hamas has fired 1,500 rockets with the deliberate purpose of killing Israeli citizens. Israel says, unlike its foes, it is trying not to kill civilians and gives warnings before it strikes. But Hamas, it says, put their launchers in densely populated areas and use Gazans as human shields. Hamas talks of generations of oppression, occupation and now blockade. It's not just its supporters who point to the imbalance in suffering and narratives of victimhood, more than 600 Palestinians dead as against 30 or so Israelis. The moral equation rests on more than intent, they would say, and if widespread civilian suffering is a predictable, inevitable consequence, it is irrelevant. Besides, what use is telling people to flee if there's nowhere to run to? There are big and bloody questions here of motive and proportionality, of the moral duties of powerful nation-states as against militant groups trying to destroy them. Above all, perhaps, in a world where wars are fought with civilian lives, do we need to redefine what is a just war? Our moral maze tonight. Panel, Melanie, Phillips, social commentator on The Times, Matthew Taylor, who's chief executive of the RSA, the Anglican priest and controversialist Giles, Fraser, and a new panellist this week, Jill Kirby, who's a political analyst and formerly director of the centre-right Centre for Policy Studies. Jill, it's a dreadful situation. Where, to your mind, does the balance of blame lie?
It is indeed a dreadful situation, but I think if we're trying to ascertain where the moral responsibility lies, then we need to look to Hamas, who launched their rockets first and into indiscriminate targets with no regard for where they might land. So I think the onus lies with them to demonstrate that they have a just cause.
Giles, Fraser?
Well, I don't even like the idea of a balance of blame here, but I mean, I've spent some time in Gaza. I've seen some of the children who have bullet wounds in their bodies, and it makes me incredibly angry the way that the Israelis chuck their ordnance around in this incredibly packed, densely populated place.
Melanie Phillips.
Well, I think the overwhelming moral question for all of us from this dreadful conflict is how a civilised country can defend its civilians against mass murder attacks when the killers choose to use their own people as human shields and sacrifices. I think Israel is facing a truly hideous dilemma in this respect, and it is doing rather better, morally speaking, than any other army in the world in similar circumstances.
Matthew Taylor.
Well, like everyone else, I guess I want a just peace. I abhor Hamas and its tactics, but I also believe Israel, as the stronger occupying power, has a moral duty of restraint, a duty which it is failing to fulfil.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Mehdi Hasan, who's political director of the Huffington Post and also does work for Al Jazeera. Mehdi Hasan, is what Israel is doing in Gaza self-defence or a war crime?
I think I'm with all of the human rights groups who've lined up both inside of Israel, like B'Tselem and Rabbis for Human Rights, and outside of Israel, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to say that what Israel is doing, regardless of whether they give it the label self-defence, is both unethical and illegal. These are war crimes. We are seeing civilians being killed in their hundreds, children being killed in their hundreds in the space of just 17 days. We've had almost 700 Palestinians killed, 160 of them children, 4,200 Palestinians wounded, 1,000 of them children, more than 100,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes. If that's not a war crime, I don't know what is.
Melanie Phillips?
What, in your view, however, is the moral justification for firing thousands of rockets with the sole intention of killing civilian Israelis?
Are you referring to the Hamas rockets?
Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the rockets coming out of Gaza.
My view is there is no moral justification for firing rockets into Israeli civilian areas, just as there's no justification for firing rockets into Palestinian civilian areas from Israel. I was taught as a child in the playground that two wrongs don't make a right.
Indeed, that is correct. But since you would agree, therefore, perhaps that Hamas is the aggressor in this respect...
No, I don't agree with that.
Oh, you don't agree with that? OK. You think that... What is the situation, then?
I think that we've had a military occupation of the Palestinian territories, which is now into its 48th year. We have a blockade on Gaza that many international lawyers and human rights groups regard as illegal, which is now into its 8th year. Okay. And I think that is the root cause of the conflict. Well, one side is unoccupied, the other side is an occupied people.
I see. That's a very interesting perspective, and we're not going to go into the rights and wrongs of the Israel-Palestine conflict on this programme, because this is a moral programme. As you know, Israel no longer occupies Gaza.
That's
and when
not true.
It came out, it is true. There is no Israeli presence in Gaza. The Israelis brought out all their civilians several years ago, 9 years ago. Since that point, Hamas has been launching rocket attacks. Hamas is the aggressor. I ask you again, how can you expect any country to put up with rocket attacks, not just on its civilian population in the south, its towns in the south, but on Tel Aviv, on its capital cities, and very recently trying to bring down civilian airliners at Ben Gurion Airport, which by any standard is a war crime?
Well, I'm not here to defend Hamas. I'm here to tell you that you asked me a question about how can people survive. Well, how can a people be expected to tolerate a 48-year military occupation?
No, I'm asking you a question.
A very long question.
Please, could you answer my question?
I'm about to answer if you let me speak. 48-year military occupation. How have people been able to tolerate that? The longest military occupation in the world. You talk about Gaza not being occupied. 14%. Well, you said Gaza was occupied, so I'm going to deal with that point. 14% of Gazan land is now occupied by Israeli buffer zones. The Israelis control Gaza's airspace, coastal waters, territorial borders. If you're born in Gaza, want to live legally in Gaza, you have to register with the Palestinian Population Registry, which is controlled by the Israelis. Let's not pretend Israel is not in full control. It's blockading Gaza, and that is the root cause of the current fight. You don't want to go back 48 years.
Right. Okay.
A blockade, which is illegal.
About the situation, you have not
you call
answered
it a rant,
my
I call your
question.
question a rant.
You have not answered my question.
Well,
how a country can protect its civilians against
simple.
these attacks.
Get a ceasefire, end the blockade, pull out of the occupied territories, follow international law.
They did pull out. They've had rocket attacks. Let me ask you another question. How can you justify, or do you feel any moral qualms about Hamas using its civilians as human shields and sacrifices? Something which is unequivocally a war crime, which has been condemned by the EU and the UN. Even Bill Clinton has said the Hamas strategy is to force Israel to kill Gazan civilians so the world will condemn it.
It's interesting to have your selective condemnation. I mean, most human rights groups have also condemned Israel for war crimes. I've made it very clear in every answer, I think, so far, that I'm not here to defend Hamas. Hamas have committed war crimes. You've not defended. How do you morally justify Israel's war crimes? You can't pick on one side of the conflict.
If you agree
the majority
that Hamas
of people who've died
crimes,
are Palestinians, Melanie. 25 members of a single family blown up on Sunday by an Israeli jet.
Well, you can't both talk at each other at the same time. One brief question.
The Palestinian representative to the UN Human Rights Commission has said Hamas is committing war crimes, Israel is not.
And I would say that
Do you disagree with him?
Of course, I agree with every human rights group and the UN Human Rights Commissioner who says there's very clear evidence that Israelis are dropping 500-pound bombs on hospitals, mosques, cafes, refugee camps, schools, people's homes, a shelter for disabled people. If those are not war crimes, as I say, I don't know what is.
Jill Kirby?
You say you're not here to defend Hamas. Would you defend Hamas's decision not to participate in a ceasefire but to launch rockets on Israel?
I'm not. I wouldn't defend it. What I would say is that it was a ceasefire that was agreed by the Israelis and the Egyptians, which did nothing about the root cause of the fighting, which is the blockade. Hamas have said that they would adhere to a ceasefire if the blockade is lifted. There was a ceasefire, Jill, in November 2012 after the last Israeli bombardment of Gaza, which Hamas and Israel both signed up to, which says in the ceasefire that Israel will start lifting the blockade. In 2013, there were fewer rockets fired into Israel from Gaza than any year since 2001, according to the International Crisis Group. The reason we're now in this chaos is because Gaza is in chaos. Gaza is besieged on all sides. 50% unemployment, 80% of people on food aid. Israel has not lifted that blockade, which UN, human rights groups, others regard as illegal. It's starving and suffocating people in that place.
So why do you think Hamas has made the decision to spend money on rockets rather than the defence of its own people?
Because Hamas is a group that probably doesn't care about many people other than itself. As I say, I'm not here to defend Hamas. If you want to say to me tonight, let's have a programme about whether Hamas commits war crimes or Hamas is a generous group, then I'll be on your side of the argument. I thought we were here to talk about the war as a whole, in which the majority of people killed have been killed by Israel.
Hamas's behaviour is appalling. appalling, and therefore the fact that, in your view, Israel's behaviour is appalling means they're both as bad as each other.
No, they're not both as bad as each other for several reasons. Number one side is doing most of the killing. Number two, one side is the occupier. Therefore, as Matthew pointed out in his opening comments, no, it's about the stronger side. One is a nuclear-armed power with the fourth strongest military in the world, illegally occupying territory, killing women and children, 100 children, just in the last how many days and weeks.
So if Hamas had succeeded in killing more Israeli women and children, you would consider that the Israelis were less morally reprehensible?
No, I would just say that Hamas is now as morally bad as Israel. I mean, look, this is it's a moral debate show, but we seem to be unable to move past the point that if one side does something wrong, that does not justify crimes on the other side. Greater crimes, I would argue. 700 people nearly killed. Do you have no, moral qualms about
your view is that both sides are immoral, one is slightly more immoral than the other.
No,
and the main reason for its greater immorality is that it succeeds in killing more people, and that the side which is defending its own people better is also the more immoral.
No, I would say not quite. I would say there are two sides in this conflict. One is both are committing war crimes. Clearly, human rights agree on that. But one side is a stronger power. One side is a side that has broken the ceasefire, that has blockaded the other side, and one side is a side that's the illegal occupier of other people's land and is chucking heavy ordnance in a way that no group in Palestine could chuck at Israel.
Mehdi, Hasan, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Colonel Richard Kemp, who's the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan and is in Jerusalem at the moment as part of the Friends of Israel initiative. Colonel Kemp, you've conducted operations of this kind, or along these lines perhaps. Can the Israelis really be trying their hardest not to kill civilians and yet leave, 600 plus dead and counting?
I think the reality is that if Israel was trying its best to kill civilians or not bothering about that, when you look at the number of rockets fired out of Gaza, the number of targets they've got in Gaza, the massive air power they have, I think you wouldn't probably see 600 Palestinians dead. You probably see 6,000 or 60,000. But what this shows, the number of missions that Israel has flown into Gaza to try and defend their people, quite clearly they're being selective about what they're hitting and killing civilians incidentally rather than killing them deliberately, because there's such a small number of civilians killed relative to the number of airstrikes. Now, that small number, I don't underestimate the misery and the suffering. I've seen firsthand what shrapnel does to babies, and it's disgusting. But nevertheless, I don't think you could argue that Israel's doing anything other than exercising the maximum restraint.
Matthew Turner?
Colonel Kemp, could you help me with the moral distinction between deliberately killing civilians and fighting in a way which makes the killing of civilians inevitable? Well, the moral distinction.
Yes, the moral position is that, and it's actually specified in the Geneva Conventions, enemy combatants are permitted to to attack a legitimate target such as a rocket position, a headquarters, a logistics point, allowed to attack them in order to defend themselves, in order to protect their people or to achieve military objectives. The fact that there are civilians in the vicinity of those objectives does not mean you cannot engage them. There is an issue of proportionality, so that you can't attack a target which has got for example, a risk of killing a very large number of people if the military advantage is relatively small. But if it isn't, there is nothing illegal about doing it. It's not nice, it's not pleasant. A pilot who carries out an airstrike in the Israeli forces, in the British forces, in the American forces, who carries out an airstrike and kills innocent people, has that to live with on his conscience for a long time. It's not something that any professional pilot from a Western democracy wishes to do.
Imagine a different scenario. Imagine if a bank robber was fleeing the scene, waving a gun. We might think it was right to shoot that bank robber. What if they had picked up a small child as they were running out of the bank? Do you don't think in those circumstances, we might think, well, it's terrible that the bank robber should get away with it. He might be dangerous, but actually we were not going to shoot him because we would kill an innocent child. Would that be the humane response in that circumstance?
Well, of course, it depends on what he's doing. If he's firing back at you as he's running, or if he's pointing his gun at the child.
It makes no difference whether he's holding a child.
It makes a difference, of course it does. But you wouldn't shoot a bank robber who was running away if he wasn't posing a threat to you anyway under the law. So I don't think that it's relevant that he's holding a child. Obviously, it's relevant that you know the way in which you deal with it, and perhaps you restrain yourself until such a time as he's in a different position. It's what he's doing to you.
That's exactly.
It's what he's doing to you. And if he's shooting at you, then it's different.
But that's exactly my point. You would make a different judgment, and you might exercise restraint. So the point is surely this, that one understands that Hamas may be using human shields. One understands that Israel needs to be able to defend itself. But if it is not possible to do that without killing lots of civilians, isn't the moral requirement to exercise restraint?
Absolutely it is. It's absolutely the moral requirement. And it's the dilemma that our forces have found themselves in Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, you name it, is the question of how you deal with the enemy that deliberately uses civilians in order to protect them and prevent you from attacking them. And it's a judgment. And if it was a military target without any human shield or without any civilian population present, then you would be quite entitled and legal. It would be lawful for you to drop as many thousands of tons of explosives on it as you wanted. If there are civilians there, you have to make a moral judgment, or a legal judgment, in fact, about whether you can or can't engage the target. The fact that there are civilians there does not, under the laws of armed conflict, preclude you from attacking. If it did, then the people like Hamas would win hands down, because there's no way you can deal with them.
Giles, Fraser?
Colonel Kemp, it does make a difference whether the civilians can escape the war zone, doesn't it?
It makes a difference as to what they can do, and there's a lot of people I've heard saying, well, they can't go anywhere, but the reality, of course, is they can go somewhere. Because what happens in this situation, and it's a similar practice that we would use and have used in Afghanistan, is that the Israelis will warn the civilian population of an impending attack on a certain area. They've got a very sophisticated means of doing that. And they will...
They leave messages on people's answer machine or that sort of thing, don't they?
They drop leaflets, they drop millions of leaflets, they send text messages, they broadcast on the radio, all in Arabic. They, in extremis, if those things don't work, if the message doesn't get through, then they will drop a munition that does not cause any damage to people, just causes a loud explosion in order to give a final warning. But if I can just finish answering your question, the Israelis will know where the people can go to. They know the geography. They will know where they can go if they're targeting a certain area. And when they go there, they will not target the area they go to. You can move a few blocks away.
Well, there's a question of trust about that.
The Israelis use bombs. They use bombs of the smallest size they possibly can for a given target.
Have you ever been into Gaza yourself?
I have.
And you understand how packed it is. I mean, one of the most packed places on the planet.
It's not the most packed place on the planet. It's probably about the 6th or 7th.
Well, okay, so one of the most packed places. That's a semantic
point. It's
so you're chucking in huge, big ordnance in this with flashette bombs and all the other sorts of, in this incredibly packed environment. And you trust the Israelis to move the civilian population around, but you know that's not happening. The amount of civilian casualties that's going on here, can't you see that that's a huge moral problem?
It is a massive moral problem, and I know that it's at the top of everybody out here's agenda. I've spoken to many military officers. I've spoken to many politicians out here who are directing the current conflict. I've spoken to soldiers on the ground. I've spoken to pilots who've flown combat missions into Gaza. It's at the top of their list of concerns. I spoke to a pilot who told me he had to abort 17 missions in one day. And I said, isn't that frustrating? He said, it's not frustrating because we aborted them because we were civilians. And the last thing we want to do is to kill innocent civilians. This is not an army that is after killing civilians. If it was, as I said earlier, there would be many, many more thousands killed than have been.
Have you heard the phrase the IDF regularly used called mowing the lawn?
I've heard that phrase used for British forces in Afghanistan. It was used by one of our brigade commanders.
I mean, because the whole idea when they use it is that what you need is a sort of a war every 2 or 3 years in Gaza to sort of keep things down. So you had Cast-led 2008-9, you had Pillar of Defence 2012. Every 2 or 3 years, you need to have a 3-week war just to... Mowing the law is really interesting because it sounds like collective punishment to me.
Well, let's see who starts these wars. In every case... And we heard earlier on that Israel left the Gaza Strip. We've also heard accusations that Israel imposed a blockade. The reason Israel closed the borders is because Hamas started to carry out terrorist attacks and fire rockets and deploy suicide bombers, so the borders were closed. Thereafter, there were rocket attacks consistently. On each occasion, 3 times that they got to the point where Israel could no longer endure it. Israel then launched a measured response. There's no other alternative. No other country would do anything different.
And how do you expect Palestinians to resist occupation?
Well, they're not under occupation, of course.
We disagree about that.
You're wrong then, because they're not under occupation.
Yes, they are.
The Israelis withdrew all of their military forces, and they withdrew all of their civilian settlements from Gaza a number of years ago, and since then they have not been in there. The only reason they've sealed the place off, and let's not forget the Egyptians are also imposing a blockade on Gaza. The only reason they've sealed the place off is because of the threat to their civilian population from Hamas.
Colonel Kemp, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Next witness is Ted Honderich, who's a great professor of the philosophy of mind and logic at University College London, radical philosopher, of course, and author of After the Terror, which was described as a moral defence of Palestinian terrorism. Do you think Hamas is morally right to try to kill Israelis?
Yes.
Civilians as well as soldiers?
Yes. Would you like to know why?
Yeah.
Okay. I've listened to the discussion up until now, and I must say it has had great recommendations, but it has lacked one fundamental, so to speak, orientation or consideration. In all these things, one needs the details, but one needs a general understanding of a situation and a general principle that one uses to defend any particular conclusions one draws. And mine, which I'd like to tell you quickly about, is something called the principle of humanity, or the principle of humanitarianism.
Can you very briefly just tell me how that applies in this case and justifies the deliberate killing of civilians?
Indeed I can. But to tell you what the principle is, it says there are fundamental human goods, fundamental human desires, to go on living, not to be in physical pain, and there are another 3. There's a total of 6 human goods, or 6 fundamental human desires.
Yeah, I don't think we've got time. I don't think we've got time for a philosophy lecture. So, sorry, we haven't got all day. Jill Kirby, your witness.
Professor Honderich, you believe the justification for war, I understand, is the promotion of universal human rights. That, as I understand it, is your extension of the principle of humanity. Is that right?
Well,
is that your position?
No, it's not. It's remote from my position.
Okay.
My position is not a vague reference to human rights, disputable, every side claiming them. My position is an articulated general one, which I agree this isn't the place to set out, but there's no point in confusing me with somebody else.
So do you believe that Israelis have human rights?
Of course. In some use of that term, virtually everybody has human rights.
But are they less humane than the Palestinians?
How could a right be less humane than the Palestinians? That's just a piece of nonsense.
Well, you're asserting
it's an indication of the low level of discussion, even on this high-level program.
You're asserting the principle of humanity, and
you haven't heard.
I have heard. I've heard what you've said about it just now, and I'm trying to get at why you think that the principle of humanity justifies Hamas in sending rockets into Israel, but doesn't, without any regard for their own citizens, but doesn't justify the Israelis from defending their own territory.
Because of the general consideration, I'll try and get it into a sentence. Because of the general consideration that Zionism, as I understand it, is a morally justified position, a morally justified project, and it was the establishing of the State of Israel within its 1948-1967 borders. Neo-Zionism is taking the last 1/5 of Palestine from the indigenous people. Nothing could justify it, and in particular the principle of humanity, which is a literal and clear thing, nothing about human rights, must condemn Neo-Zionism, and I do.
Melanie Phillips?
Let's not go into the history, which I think is more than a little eccentric, if not downright wrong.
It's not the history. It's not the history. It's a general consideration of the problem in front of us.
Do you support the Hamas?
I've said that.
You do support the Hamas?
Of course.
Right. So you support the aims of the Hamas, which are to eradicate the State of Israel and to kill all Jews in a genocidal project. As you know, the Hamas Charter says, "For our struggle against the Jews is extremely wide-ranging and grave. The time of the Prophet will not come until Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them."
You support that? That is merely right-wing drivel.
Oh, Hamas Charter is right-wing drivel, is it?
If I were thought
is the Hamas Charter right-wing drivel?
If I were thought to support that, you wouldn't think that I ought to be in this high-level program.
I don't think you should be on this high-level program. In fact, I think you're morally very suspect. I'm asking you whether you support...
I don't think you ought to be on the program either.
You said you support the Hamas, and now you're disavowing support for the
Not two at once, please.
I can tell you why I support Hamas, and I've tried, and it's got nothing to do with your interpretation of my beliefs.
It's not my interpretation. It's what they say themselves.
You must read a book or two. You must get above the level.
I'm reading to you the charter.
You must get above the level of right-wing journalism.
Can we stop a second? Can we stop the personal abuse just for a second? And can you not acknowledge that this is in the Hamas charter and just respond to that and tell us whether that affects your own support for them?
I support Hamas insofar as Hamas acts in accordance with the principle of humanity, which indeed it is, in trying to defend a victimized people against an oppression and an occupation, to forget the general situation, to get down to, for example, military details of intentionality, to forget the general situation is bound to make any judgment a judgment wanting in moral intelligence.
Professor Honderich, how can it possibly be in any moral universe that the principle of humanity is upheld by genocide?
I haven't informed you that the principle of humanity does uphold genocide.
But you are supporting a project for genocide and saying it upholds the principle of humanity.
It is insane to suppose that the Palestinians are engaged in a program.
Why is it insane? Genocide. They say it all the time.
Well, they may say anything all the time, but I'm here being concerned with the facts and with argument. And for you to announce that the Palestinians are committed to genocide, as the Germans were with respect to the Jewish people, is a piece of arrant nonsense.
Go on.
You say it's arrant nonsense, but you are simply repeating your denial of facts. I'm presenting you with facts. You support the Hamas. The Hamas believe in the eradication of Israel, the annihilation of all Jews. You say that accords with the principle of humanity. It follows from what you have said. You support this project. Why are you trying to weasel out of what you so proudly told us? You support terrorism. You support the Hamas.
Yeah, we got the point, Melanie.
I deny absolutely your understanding of Hamas. I deny absolutely that the principle of humanity is anything of the sort you think it is. It is something which is totally superior to, for example, the mishmash of conservatism, which you purvey pretty regularly in the press. There is no reflective intelligence, in general, about your position, and I have that recommendation.
Professor Honderich, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. Hugo Slim, who's Associate Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford University Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, a specialist in the ethics of war and author of Killing Civilians, Method, Madness and Morality in War. Two things, really. Can Israel's actions be morally justified? And do we need to rewrite the rules of war?
Well, on the first point, I think it's a difficult truth in the laws of war and in the ethics of war. And we know, and we've seen this last 2 weeks in many ways, that every civilian death is a tragedy. But it is not necessarily a war crime. And it is, strangely, legal to kill civilians, as we've heard, but not to do so deliberately and without due precautions. So the case that Israel has to answer is a case about military necessity. How has it argued that the civilians it's killed have been, in a sense, legal acts? And that's the challenge the State of Israel faces.
Though we're concentrating on morality rather than legality, it's all covered, is it, by our current approach to a just war, the rules of a just war?
I think the trouble is, if you try and rewrite the laws of war, I think literally you'll probably end up rewriting them as they are, because it's incredibly difficult to find a new way of talking about war.
Giles, Fraser.
Do you share my anxiety that the rules of war often favour the powerful, those who have sophisticated weapons that can distinguish and isolate various targets, and make it more problematic for those who haven't got that sort of weaponry to fight?
No, I think the smart weaponry is actually a huge contribution. If you compare aerial bombing from the Vietnam War to the wars of the recent 10 years, I think smart technology is a huge asset.
And that's right. And the Israelis have it,
war.
but the Hamas say don't. So how do Hamas fight?
Well, they have to find other ways to fight because, frankly, they cannot choose to fight immorally. I agree with the idea.
So if you've got the munitions, then you're letting the Israelis can fight because they've got the right sort of guns, but the Hamas can't fight because they've got the wrong sort of unsophisticated weapons.
You're talking asymmetric warfare. Now, look, I understand the concept of asymmetric warfare, and it is a real one. But asymmetric warfare does not justify asymmetric morality. And you cannot start saying that it is fine to kill civilians in the way that Hamas have on buses and in restaurants in Israel, and are desperately trying to do now with their rockets.
So how would you advise, say if we say this is a war, and let's take out the big politics, how would you advise Hamas to fight back?
Right, I think they should think very hard about protecting their civilians. And I think they need to do that.
But that's not fighting back.
No, because what they're doing at the moment is, in a way, they're inviting a pattern of warfare in which their civilians will inevitably be killed, and that is negligent in my view. I think they have to find a way. Resistance does not always require violence. We know that, and actually they have to find different ways.
So you're telling the people, you're telling the Hamas, that the Palestinians, they can't fight back because they haven't got the right sort of weapons, but the Israelis, who've got the very fourth biggest army in the world, they've got these sophisticated, they can do it because they can make morally accurate interventions.
Right, well, the other thing they can do, Giles, is the Palestinians, I mean, we're not talking about all Palestinians here, because a lot of people don't want a violent struggle. We're talking about Islamic Jihad and Hamas and other people. Sure. So they can choose to fight by the rules of war and by the ethics of war, and they can target Israeli military facilities and things like that. They can actually target militarily. They don't want to do that. And that's why I think, they fight immorally.
Matthew Turner?
It's kind of going rather well for both sides, isn't it? Israel are getting to mow the grass, kill a few terrorists, and Hamas are getting a great propaganda victory. So they might be quite pleased with where they've got to, aren't they?
Well, I think that you're right, Matthew. We've seen this tragic pattern three times now.
So what are we going to do about it? Do we just stand back and observe it coolly and say this is just the nature of things?
My view, actually, is that the Israeli strategy now needs to be stopped, because there's a great phrase in war ethics, which is that at a certain point, if things shock the public conscience of the world, then we must act in that respect. And I do feel that most people around the country, around the world now, feel we understand the Israeli approach, we understand the illegality of Hamas's actions, the deceit and perfidy, but actually the killing of civilians is now too far.
So I agree with that. So do you agree that in the end, if terrorists, for example, organisations like Hamas, are committed to using civilians as human shields, and if this is not a situation we want to persist, then in the end, however hard it is, however much one understands Israel's dilemmas, it will probably be leadership from a democratic, strong power like Israel that will be required. We have to look for them for leadership out of this situation, rather than expecting it from a small, relatively disorganised extreme group like Hamas, for example.
Well, I don't think they're disorganised, actually, but I also think that that's not probably how it works. If you want to talk the politics of the situation, I think you'll probably find that there are back channels between Hamas and Israel that are talking all the time, and at a certain point they will probably agree that this is the way to do it.
But you agree that in the end, if we are going to move forward, it probably is going to require an act of courage, a restraint, generosity even from Israel in relation to trying to move on.
Yes, because Hamas will require, as they're asking for now, a face-saving measure, some kind of method of easing the blockade or ending the blockade, in order for them to declare victory. And Hamas always do declare victory after these appalling struggles in which so many people die.
So therefore, although you recognise that in a sense what Israel doing is legal, actually your moral view is that morally Israel should show restraint, as it is probably the only way to go forward.
Well, I think Israel has shown restraint morally in the way it fights. I think it's been exemplary in the way it has prioritised. In the way it's prioritised protecting its own civilians. I think Hamas should learn from that, actually. But I think the time now has come. Yes, I think the time now is to stop, because I think the public conscience says no. We understand the logic, but actually our moral intuitions say, no, you can't kill whole families, you can't have children dying in this way. Now we need to do something else.
Dr. Slim, thank you very much indeed. Let's drag some of these threads together. Can we start with our first witness, Mehdi Hasan, who's powerful arguments and very articulate, but his basic position was that he wasn't here to defend Hamas. He wanted to talk about Israel's actions in isolation. Giles, is that a valid position?
A perfectly valid position. You can condemn both. You can condemn both. And I think, there is...
Which he did, to be fair.
He did condemn both. He condemned Hamas and he condemned Israel. And so, I think it's perfectly... I thought he was articulate, and I thought he had it dead right. I mean...
and I thought I have to say, I thought it was very interesting that both Jill and Melanie were stuck on trying to get him to say something that he had no intention of saying because he doesn't believe it. They were stuck on repeatedly trying to get him to say sympathise with Hamas. And it's interesting that is the only tactic that you've got to expose him.
But I suppose my question is it possible to make judgments about the Israelis' action in a vacuum without considering the actions of Hamas in this case? Melanie?
His apparent moral equivalence is first of all dishonest because he doesn't go around attacking Hamas. He only did so on this programme. Secondly, he is stuck on this idea that Israel is committing war crimes. Now, if you think that, then you are basically criminalising people who are trying to defend against aggression. He will not accept... Just a minute, Giles. He will not accept the historical and actual reality that Hamas is the aggressor in this. He also is stuck on the idea that because 700 or 600 people have been killed, this shows that Israel is committing war crimes. This is, as we've heard from subsequent witnesses, this is completely ridiculous, not least because a proportion, I would suggest a very large proportion of those people who've been killed are in fact people bent on killing the innocent. What is he saying? That he supports both sides equally, but he doesn't support Israel taking out people who would otherwise kill their own civilians?
I think he was saying that he felt both sides were morally indefensible, but the fact that one had killed more than the other, or ended up killing more than the other, made them somehow worse. Argument. Precisely.
It's obvious that Israel is often the aggressor. I mean, I've personally experienced it. I've stood in the middle of a big empty pile of rubble on Rafah, on the south of the Gaza Strip, and had the IDF shoot bullets at me for doing nothing, with no warning, for being just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They no intention, inclination, no sense that I shouldn't have been there.
This is complete garbage, Giles. Whatever your personal experience may have been, historically speaking, Hamas is the aggressor.
No.
Israel came out of Gaza. The result was that Hamas started... Oh, don't be ridiculous. Hamas started suicide bombings and rocket attacks. They are now tunnelling under Gaza's border in order to kidnap and murder Israeli civilians.
Okay, Matthew?
What I was struck by in that conversation was that I had enormous sympathy for Mehdi Hasan's position. I had enormous sympathy for Richard Kemp's position. That is to say, I understood how Mehdi Hasan was defending the need of the Palestinians to defend themselves and get out of a situation which they've been placed in. I understood Richard Kemp's description of the way the Israelis try to avoid civilian deaths. And that's why, for me, I was so glad that Hugo Sims said what he said at the end, because in the end, in a way, you can sympathise with both sides in the position that they are in. You don't sympathise with Hamas, but you can sympathise with Palestinians. It is going to require an act which goes beyond what you're allowed to do, what you may feel you've got the right to do. It will require an act beyond that to get us out of where we are.
But the problem with our last speaker, Dr. Slim, and I think, he was trying to think his way through what is effectively, we can all see as a tremendous dilemma, what he can certainly see as a tremendous dilemma. I'm not quite sure about everybody else around this table. But his point that, there comes a point where the shock to the public conscience of the West means that Israel has got to stop. Well, I'm sorry, in Israel, they grieve over the Palestinian deaths, which are caused by using the civilians as human shields and human sacrifices. But the fact is that if Israel were to stop now, Israeli civilians would be killed. That is the reality. That's the only reason Israel is doing this.
In the end.
Giles' suggestion that Israel does this every few years because it likes killing is obscene.
I didn't say that.
No, hang on a second, Jill.
In the end, if the better TV, if you can win the propaganda war, is more or less what he seemed to be admitting at the end, in fact, and which Mehdi Hasan was also arguing. If you can win the propaganda war, then the other side's going to have to back off, even if they've got right on their side. Because if you can get enough terrible TV pictures of children who are drawn into the crossfire and are killed, then so that is an argument for terrorism, in effect.
Exactly.
Can I move on to Professor Honderich, who, and if we can sort of park the mutual antipathies to one side and talk about his general position. There wasn't room for him to unpack his principle of humanity, but I still wasn't clear, Giles, perhaps you might be, how that would justify the deliberate killing of, in this case, Israeli civilians.
It seemed to me what he was saying is that there comes a point where people are morally justified in resisting occupation. Now, you may not want to talk about it in terms of the occupation, but for him, the occupation is absolutely essential. If Israel stuck within its pre-67 borders, that's absolutely fine. He's a Zionist. The moment that, for him, Israel invades and occupies Palestinian territories, then the Palestinians themselves are morally justifying in resisting. That's what his line was.
But didn't you find it... I found it chilling that in the end what he was arguing was that grievance allows any behaviour. Now, you may believe you may or may not believe that his grievance is right, but as we know in many parts of the world, let's think for example about eastern Ukraine, there are mutual grievances, and if we live in a world that says if my grievance is right, then anything is justified in pursuit of that grievance, then we are in a very dangerous world, Giles.
I thought he was extremely slippery about trying to articulate any kind of coherent principles, and really wanted to set his own parameters without explaining what they were, which made it very difficult to get any sense out of him. But I think what was, as Matthew said, chilling was the fact that he felt provided he could work from his own narrow parameters, then anything could be justified, and however much bloodletting was required. I couldn't relate to his explanation of anything here.
Melanie,
I thought his arguments were quite frankly morally depraved, and I'm astonished that Giles should be saying what he's saying. Let's park for a moment whether it's an occupation or not. Let's assume that it is an occupation. Let's assume there is a genuine grievance. Giles, surely nothing justifies the deliberate murder of innocent people.
There's a question about...
You cannot justify
the question
terrorism.
Is about how... So, in terms of just war stuff, this is a question. I'm asking this as a question. How do you morally resist occupation? Now, that's
through killing the innocent.
That is problematic.
Killing the innocent?
So, this is war.
That's
we're
problematic
talking about
for
war
you?
Here, and that's why we're talking about just war.
We're not talking about war. We're talking about resistance.
War.
You're talking about resistance.
And it's an act... This is a war we're talking about.
No, you're talking about resistance.
Yeah,
you are saying that
war.
if people are entitled to resist by killing the innocent.
Giles,
you're a priest.
They're not. It's not by killing the innocent. It's about how you resist.
We apply that principle
Can
to
you
French
resist
resistance.
occupation?
One at a time, please.
I think people are morally justified in resisting occupation.
By killing the innocent.
I don't want that to happen. But if it's war, it's war.
That is a principle we apply to the French resistance. After all, the end. If the French resistance committed atrocities, our historical view is that whatever the nature of that crime, it was something that was
civilians?
just...
But I can't see why you think... Why you let the Israelis off the hook on that? But then if the Palestinians
Israelis
do
do not
something...
deliberately kill
One
civilians.
at a time, please.
They do not deliberately kill civilians.
Well, I don't know.
That is the moral difference.
So I don't know about that. I mean,
you don't know about that?
No, I don't know about that as it happens.
That is what we're trying to get to the bottom of here. What is the motive? Is the motive a moral one or not? And is the justification a moral one or not? It's not about how many people end up getting killed. It's about what the motive is. And I think we had some difficulty in getting any sense out of that on most of the witnesses. But it was very clear to me that Honderich felt there was no need for any morality at all. And I think, Giles, I'm concerned by your assumptions that actually if you're resisting, then you can do just whatever you like.
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, it sounded rather like it. Matthew?
No. I think Jill's right in the sense that I think motive does matter, and I think that Professor Honderich's kind of refusal to respond to Melanie's points about the Hamas Charter are relevant. I mean, my view of this would be slightly different if I didn't feel that Hamas were part of a much broader extremist movement.
Well, that's it for this rather fraught week from panel Melanie Phillips, Giles Fraser, Matthew Taylor and Jill Kirby. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.